The night smelled of wood smoke and wet wool, and Miriam Ashby had been standing near the same column for the better part of an hour. She was not hiding, precisely. She was simply occupying the particular kind of stillness that had always come naturally to her. The stillness of a woman who had learned early that the less space she took up, the safer she was. The ballroom of Thornley House blazed around her, every chandelier lit, every mirror throwing the light back twice, until the whole assembly glittered like something that would vanish if you touched it. She was not part of the glitter. Her gown was a pale ash grey, chosen by her mother, which was to say it had been chosen as a statement, presentable, but not competition. Lady Sophronia wanted admirers for herself, not rivals in her own household. Miriam did not mind the grey. It kept people from looking too long. She was watching the garden. The French doors at the far end of the ballroom had been left ajar, a concession to the candle heat. And through the gap came a sliver of cold October air and the faint amber light of the lanterns strung along the garden path. A man was out there, not a guest. His coat was plain. His posture, that of someone accustomed to being invisible at gatherings like this. He had come from the stables, she thought, or perhaps from the servants' entrance around the side. He was carrying a covered pail, a delivery of some kind, and he would have passed through unremarked, if not for what he stopped to do. There was a child in the garden, small perhaps 4 or 5, wearing a footman's livery, 2 sizes too large. A servant's child, she supposed, fallen asleep in the cold on one of the stone benches. The man with the pail had nearly walked past. Then he stopped. He set the pail down, shrugged off his coat without any particular drama about it, and laid it over the sleeping child with the same matter-of-fact care a person might use to close a book they intended to return to. He picked up his pail again and went on. That was all. He did not look around to see if anyone had witnessed his small generosity. He simply did it and was gone. Miriam felt something move in her chest, something warm and unlooked for, like finding a lit candle in a room you expected to be dark. A hand closed around her elbow. There you are. Her mother's voice was a blade wrapped in silk. Lady Sophronia Ashby had a gift for appearing from nowhere at the worst possible moments, perfumed and dressed in Prussian blue, her eyes doing the perpetual calculation they always did in rooms like this. Lord Carbury has been asking for you. Go and be charming, Miriam. For once in your life, try. Miriam looked back at the garden. The man and his pail were gone. The child slept undisturbed, wrapped in a stranger's coat. Yes, Mama, she said. The summons came 2 days later at breakfast. Miriam had always thought that the most terrible things happened in drawing rooms, where a person could arrange their face and choose their words. Instead, her mother chose the breakfast table where Miriam was still in her wrapper, her hair undressed, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had gone cold while she read. Her father was not present. He was rarely present for anything anymore. His study door closed against them all like a verdict. Lady Sophronia swept in with a sheaf of papers and the expression of a woman who had spent the night rehearsing. Lord Carbury's man of business called yesterday, she said, setting the papers down beside the toast rack with a decisive click. The terms are agreed. The settlement will be signed by the end of the month. Miriam set down her cup. What settlement? Your marriage settlement, obviously. Her mother pulled out the chair across from her and sat, which was worse somehow than her standing. Sitting implied she intended to be there a while. Lord Carbury has agreed to clear your father's debts in their entirety. The gaming debts, the merchant debts, the loan from Lord Fenwick, all of it. In exchange, you will marry him before Christmas. The papers on the table were columns of numbers. Miriam did not need to read them to understand what they represented. Years of her father's recklessness made legible, her family's ruin reduced to arithmetic. She had known it was coming, had known for months. in the way a person knows a storm is coming when the light goes strange and the birds stop singing. She had simply not known when it would arrive. "I will not," she said. Her mother's expression did not change. "I beg your pardon." "I will not marry Lord Carbury." Miriam's voice was quiet, as it always was. It was the voice of a woman who had spent years being unheard and had not until this moment decided whether that mattered. "He is cruel to his horses, cruel to his servants, and he has already buried one wife. I will not be the second." Lady Sophronia leaned forward. "You will be the Countess of Carbury. You will have a house in town and an estate in Wiltshire and more pin money than you could spend in a decade. I will also have Lord Carbury." The silence that followed was the kind that precedes a door slamming. Then, her mother rose from the table, gathered her papers, and looked at Miriam with an expression of pure, cold disappointment. The kind that had been Miriam's inheritance since childhood. "You have a week," she said. "If you do not agree by Thursday, I will have your father sign the papers without your consent. You are 24 years old, Miriam. You are not the heroine of a novel. You do not have the luxury of sensibility." She left. Miriam sat alone at the breakfast table, the untouched toast going cold beside the columns of numbers. Outside the window, a sparrow landed on the sill and regarded her with a small blank eye, then flew away. A week. She thought about what a week meant. She thought about Lord Carbury's hands, thick-fingered and proprietorial, already reaching for her arm at the Thornley ball as if she were something he had already purchased. She thought about her father's study, with its permanent smell of brandy and its closed door. She thought about her mother's face. Not the fury, but what lay beneath the fury. The fear, the desperate, clawing fear of a woman who had always defined herself by her position and was watching it crumble. And then she thought about a man in a garden, giving a coat to a child who would never know his name. She did not know why that image returned to her, only that it did insistently, like a door that wanted to be opened. She asked the housekeeper. Mrs. Farron was a practical woman who kept the servants' records with the precision of an actuary, and when Miriam described the man she had seen at the Thornley ball, quiet, plain coat, dark hair, came from the direction of the stables. Mrs. Farron knew exactly who she meant without pausing to think. "That be one of the Thornley grooms, miss. Or was. I believe he's taken on as a head groom at one of the neighbouring estates, since. A place called Hallow. He goes by Connell." "Hallow," Miriam repeated. "Edge of the village, up the lane past the ford. The Ashmore property, though the family's been absent some years." Mrs. Farron looked at her with the thoughtful, non-judgmental expression of a woman who had seen a great deal of strange things in service and had learned not to ask, "Is there anything else, Miss Ashby?" "No," Miriam said. "Thank you." She walked to Hallow the following morning before anyone in the house was awake. The estate was larger than she had expected, not grand exactly, but substantial. The kind of stone-built property that had been there long enough to look as though the land had grown up around it rather than the other way. The gates were unlocked. The grounds were well kept, in the particular way of a property that is maintained without love, trimmed and orderly, but not alive. She followed the gravel path to the stable yard and found a man splitting wood. In the grey October light, his sleeves rolled back, working with a focused, unhurried efficiency. He looked up when her footsteps crunched on the gravel. He was younger than she had imagined from a distance. Perhaps 30, perhaps a little more. His face was all clean, spare angles, a dusting of dark stubble along a jaw that had once, she thought obscurely, known a valet. His eyes were a light, clear grey, the colour of a sky about to change. He looked at her with no expression whatsoever, which was more disconcerting than suspicion would have been. "Miss," he said. "I believe you are called Connell," Miriam said. "I am. I saw you at the Thornley ball in the garden." She watched his face, a small, careful stillness. the child on the bench. You gave her your coat. He said nothing for a moment. Then, she was cold. S. Yes. Miriam took a breath. This was the part of her plan, if it could be called a plan, that she had rehearsed a dozen times, and that still felt standing here in the chill with the smell of wood smoke and horses around her, like lunacy. I have a proposition for you, Mr. Connell. I realize we are strangers, and I realize this is extraordinary. But I am in a situation that requires an extraordinary solution. He set down his axe. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has heard many things in his life and is prepared to hear one more. Go on then, he said. I need to be married, she said, not to the man my mother has chosen, to someone else, to someone who is nothing to do with my world, someone my family cannot claim as their victory. She opened her reticule and took out a small cloth purse. I have £45. It is everything I have that is my own. I am offering it to you if you will marry me this week. He looked at the purse, he looked at her face. Something moved in his grey eyes, not greed, not contempt, but the look of a man taking a precise measurement of something difficult. £45, he said. Yes. And what would I be getting myself into, exactly, beyond £45 and a wife I didn't bargain for? My mother's wrath. Wrath, she said honestly, possibly some legal unpleasantness, and a marriage that would be a marriage in name only if you are willing. I don't ask anything of you beyond the ceremony itself. You would give me a name that is not Lord Carbury's. That is all I want. He was quiet for a long time. A horse shifted in one of the loose boxes behind him, and the sound of its hooves on the straw felt very loud. The money, he said finally. I won't take it, she blinked. I beg your pardon? I don't want your £45. He looked at her steadily, without apology. If I agree to this, it won't be for money. Keep it. You'll need it before this is over, I expect. She stared at him. This was not what she had prepared for. She had expected negotiation, or refusal, or the small, contemptuous laugh of a man who thought she was amusing. She had not expected this quiet, inflexible decency that sat on him as naturally as his worn coat. Then why? She began. Because you looked at a child sleeping in the cold, he said, simply, and thought it worth remembering. And because where you're going, back to that house, to that man your mother wants to hand you to. I don't think you'll find many people who notice small things. He picked up his axe again and looked at her over his shoulder. There would be conditions, he said. Yes, she said, whatever you ask, you'll live as I live while we're here. No fine arrangements, no special treatment, just the work and the quiet. He paused. And I am a private man, Miss Ashby. I'll not be asked about what I don't volunteer. She thought of Lord Carbury's wet-lipped smile. She thought of her mother's face, tight with the triumph of a woman who had been scheming for months. She thought of the sparrow on the windowsill, flying away. When shall we do it? She asked. Tomorrow, he said, before you change your mind or your mother locks your door, the vicar at St. Clement's was a tired man who had long since stopped asking questions about the people who came to him. And when a plainly dressed woman and a groom from the Hallow estate arrived at 8:30 in the morning with their papers in order. She noted, with relief, that he gave his full name at the register without hesitation. Callum Connell. He married them in 11 minutes and returned to his breakfast. She was Mrs. Connell before her mother's household had sat down to their tea. The cottage that came with the groom's position at Hallow was 3 rooms and a kitchen garden, and it smelled of cold stone and dried lavender, and it was the first space that had ever been entirely Miriam's own. She was not, in the ordinary way of things, a domestic creature. Her upbringing had been decorative rather than practical. She had been taught to arrange flowers and embroider and converse, not to cook or manage a fire or mend. The first week on Hallow Lane was an education in her own incompetence that she found, to her bewilderment, almost interesting. She burned things. She dropped things. She once spent 40 minutes trying to understand the workings of a flint and steel while the kindling went cold. But she learned, and learning felt. It felt like having a task. Like belonging to herself. Connell was courteous and enormously difficult to know. He left early each morning for the stables. He returned in the evenings smelling of horses and cold air. Washed his hands at the pump in the kitchen yard, ate whatever she had managed to produce without comment, and spent his evenings reading. The books on the shelf above the fireplace were not what she expected from a groom. Virgil's Georgics, a collection of letters by a Scots philosopher she didn't recognize, a battered volume of Herodotus. She ran a finger along their spines one evening while he was out and felt the shape of a life she couldn't yet map. He slept on the settle in the main room. The bedroom was hers. He had made this clear on the first evening. With the same matter-of-fact finality he applied to everything, and she had not missed the fact that it was not a concession. It was a principle. She watched him, carefully, the way she had always watched things, in the sidelong, patient way of someone who has learned that direct observation makes people perform rather than simply be. She watched him with the draft horse that had come up lame in October. The hours of patient work, the low, steady voice he used, the way he seemed to be in no hurry whatsoever about anything. She watched him pause every evening to top up a small water dish outside the cottage door for whatever came to drink in the night. She watched him read, his forearm propped on the table, the lamplight on the side of his face, and she thought, not for the first time, "Who are you?" The letter from her mother arrived at the end of the second week. She did not read it aloud. She sat with it in the kitchen and read it herself, twice, her hands very still. It was not a letter so much as a document of war. Lady Sophronia had engaged a solicitor. She was petitioning for annulment on the grounds that Miriam had been coerced by an opportunist of low character into an unlawful contract. Lord Carbury, the letter made clear, was prepared to wait. Connell came in for his supper and found her sitting at the table with the letter in front of her and the soup untouched. He read the letter over her shoulder, which surprised her. She had not given him permission, but he did not ask, and somehow it seemed right, the way a man checks the weather before he speaks. "They'll not leave it alone," he said. "No." He sat down across from her. His grey eyes moved over her face with the same calibrating attention he gave difficult horses. "There is something I ought to have told you before we married," he said. "I didn't, because I did not think it would matter, and because it is not a thing I speak of. But it matters now." She looked at him. "My name is not only Connell," he said. "Callum Connell is the name I was given at birth and the name I put on the register. That is true and legal, but I am also known by another name in other places." He paused. "I am the Earl of Hallow." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a wind pressed against the window with the gentle, persistent pressure of something that intended to get in eventually. "This estate," Miriam said, "is mine? Yes. You are its owner. I am. And the groom. A role I took on 2 years ago when I returned from abroad and found I had no particular interest in being the Earl of Hallow anymore." His voice was even, but there was something behind it that was not even at all. "I had been away a long time. There was a great deal here I was not prepared to come back to." She thought of the books, the Georgics, the letters, the Herodotus. She thought of the way the house, the main house, which she had never entered, stood at the edge of the property with its shuttered windows and its unloved, maintained grounds, like a question no one was answering. "What are you preparing yourself for, then?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face shifted fractionally, the way ice shifts before it begins to break. So subtly, you might not be certain you had seen it at all. "I don't know yet," he said. They went to the house the following morning. She had not asked to see it. He had simply said at breakfast in the manner of a man who has made a decision in the night. "I think you should come with me." And so she had walked beside him up the gravel path she had walked alone 2 weeks earlier, and this time the front door was opened from inside by a housekeeper who had clearly been waiting for this moment for quite some time. Mrs. Kintyre was a broad, steady woman from Perthshire, with silver hair, and the eyes of someone who has been managing difficult situations for 30 years, and does not intend to be managed in return. She looked at Callum with an expression composed entirely of relief, and she looked at Miriam with an expression that was something more complicated. Cautious, searching, not unkind. "The house has been kept," Mrs. Kintyre said, leading them through the entrance hall. "I've done what I could." Miriam saw what she had done. The floors were clean, the woodwork dusted, the holland covers on the furniture immaculate. But the house breathed like a held breath. Every room was waiting. The dining room, the morning room, the library. All beautiful, all silent, all exquisitely emptied of the life that had once been in them. In the library, Callum stopped in front of the fireplace. On the mantelpiece was a photograph in a silver frame. A woman, laughing, dark-eyed, her head tipped back slightly as if she had been in the middle of something wonderful when the picture was taken. "My wife," he said. "Beatrice. She died here 2 years ago. A fever in the spring. She had been ill for. It came quickly, in the end." Miriam looked at the photograph. Beatrice had been beautiful in the unself-conscious way of someone who never thought about it. "Is that why you left?" Miriam asked. "I could not stay." He said it simply, without drama, which was the most honest way a person could say a thing like that. "I came back when I could. I thought if I came back as a groom, just to work the land and keep myself occupied, I thought I could bear it." "Could you? Some days," he said. "Less so lately." She looked at him. This man she had married for £45 she had never needed to spend, and she thought, "I found you on a night when I needed to see that decency existed, and you were here all along, trying to convince yourself you were someone smaller than you are." She did not say any of this. She simply crossed to the window and looked out at the grounds. Overgrown in a quiet, hopeful way, the kind of overgrown that wanted tending rather than clearing. "The kitchen garden at the cottage is very well," she said, "but it's too small. There are things I'd like to try with more space." A pause behind her. "Then use the grounds," he said. "I thought I might," she said, and turned back to face him. What happened between them in the weeks that followed was not courtship. It was something slower and less formal than that. The way two people who have agreed to share a space gradually learn to share it without apology. She worked in the walled garden that ran along the south side of the main house, and he began eating his suppers there when the evenings were long enough. And one afternoon, she came in from the garden to find him at the kitchen table with the Herodotus open, reading aloud to himself in a low voice. And she sat down across from him with her cup of tea and did not say a word, and he kept reading. And neither of them thought this was unusual. He began, almost without her noticing, to use her name. Not Miss Ashby. She had stopped being Miss Ashby on the morning they married, but she, and you, and eventually, quietly, Miriam. The first time he said it, she kept her face very still so as not to make too much of it. "I need to tell you something," he said one evening, looking up from a letter he had been reading. She waited. "My mother is coming." Lady Evangeline Connell, Dowager Countess of Hallow, arrived 3 days later in a carriage that managed to be both practical and imposing, which seemed to reflect her character exactly. She was a small woman of perhaps 60, with her son's grey eyes and a manner that suggested she had long since stopped finding other people surprising. She looked at Miriam for a very long time. "He wrote to me," the Dowager said, when Callum had stepped away to speak to Mrs. Kintyre. "First letter in 2 years. he said, he had married without warning, and that I should not judge quickly. I hope you will not, Miriam said. I have no intention of it. The dowager settled herself in the chair by the fire with the ease of a woman returning to a familiar room. Sit down, child. I want to hear the whole of it. Miriam sat and told her. All of it, from the man in the garden to the morning at the vicar's, to the letter from her mother that was now in the hands of Callum's solicitor. The dowager listened without interrupting. When Miriam finished, she was quiet for a moment. He was disappearing, the dowager said finally. Before you came, he was disappearing. This house was a monument, and he was. He was becoming part of the monument. She looked at her son's portrait above the mantelpiece. A formal thing in oils, him younger in the clothes of his title, someone else's idea of who he was. The man I raised is not in that portrait. The man I raised is the one who gave his coat to a child in the cold. Yes, Miriam said, that is who he still is. I wondered, sometimes, if he had forgotten. The dowager looked at her. I think perhaps you reminded him. The legal matter resolved more quickly than Miriam had expected, and less cleanly. Lady Sophronia's solicitor had prepared his case on the assumption that Callum Connell was a common labourer, with no resources, no position, and no means of defence. The revelation that he was, in fact, the Earl of Hallow, with his own solicitor, his own standing in law, and a marriage certificate that bore his full legal name in his own handwriting, was, by all accounts, a significant professional setback. Lord Carbury withdrew his interest with the speed of a man who had never been interested at all, only convinced that he could get away with it. Her mother was harder. Miriam went to her herself on a grey afternoon, 3 weeks after the solicitors had settled matters, alone, without Callum, because this was something she needed to do without armour. Her mother received her in the drawing room in the way of someone who had been rehearsing an entirely different scene and was now required to improvise. You have made a fool of me, Lady Sophronia said. I have made a choice, Miriam said. I know they feel the same to you. I am sorry for the first, and not for the second. Her mother looked at her, really looked at her in the way she very seldom did, as if she were seeing someone she had not been expecting to find. You have always been so quiet, she said, and it was not quite an accusation and not quite an acknowledgement. It was the observation of a woman who had misread something for a long time. I know, Miriam said. The silence between them was not warm, but it was honest, which was more than they had managed in years. Will you be content, her mother asked, finally, stiffly, with him, with all of it? Yes, Miriam said. Her mother looked away toward the window, and something in her face, beneath the calculation, beneath the performance, shifted into something older and more tired. I was not content, she said, very quietly, as if speaking to the window rather than to Miriam. With your father, from the beginning, I thought if we had the right connections, the right house, I thought contentment would come with the rest of it. Miriam did not speak. She simply waited, in the way she had learned to wait. It doesn't, her mother said. Obviously. No, Miriam agreed. It was the most honest conversation they had ever had, and it did not fix anything, and it did not need to. It simply was. A door left slightly ajar, where before there had been only a wall. The house at Hallow woke up in the spring. Miriam had not planned it deliberately. She was not a woman who planned grand gestures. But she had begun to spend more of her days in the main house, and then Callum had begun to spend his evenings there, rather than at the stable yard. And then one morning she had come downstairs to find the holland covers folded neatly on the chairs and the windows thrown open for the first time in years. And Mrs. Kintyre is in the kitchen with an expression of quiet, contained satisfaction. He did it himself, Mrs. Kintyre said, before dawn. Miriam went to find him. He was in the library, standing at the window looking out over the grounds where the daffodils had come up along the south wall in a long, ragged, cheerful row. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning, Miriam." She stood beside him at the window. The grounds were not yet beautiful. They would need another season, maybe 2, but they were unmistakably alive. The walled garden she had worked through autumn and winter was a study in green, tentative and sturdy at the same time. "I've been thinking," he said, "about the House of Lords, about the land question. There are things I saw when I was living on Hallow Lane about how estate workers are housed, how they are paid, that I'd been aware of them before, abstractly. I wasn't any longer." "No," she said, "I don't imagine you were. I should go back." He meant to London, to his seat, to the life he had shed like a coat 2 years ago. "I should do it properly this time." She looked at him. In the clear spring light, he looked like himself. Not like the monument in the portrait above the fireplace, and not like the groom with the axe in the stable yard, but like the man in between, the one she had been slowly coming to know since October. "Then we will go," she said. He turned to look at her. Something in his grey eyes had changed, had been changing for months, she realized. The way the light changes in a room when someone opens a window, so gradually, you can't name the moment it happened, only the fact that the room is different now. "I want to tell you something," he said. She waited. "That morning in the garden, the child on the bench, I didn't think anyone had seen." A small pause. "It's a strange thing to be seen doing something you didn't do for an audience." "I know," she said. "That is precisely why it mattered." He reached up and touched her face lightly, as if asking a question. She tilted her chin up, and he kissed her. Quietly at first, then with a warmth that was not quiet at all. That was the accumulated warmth of months of shared mornings and evenings, and all the small dignities of a life being carefully rebuilt. When they broke apart, she rested her forehead against his for a moment. "Callum," she said, his name, his real name, plain and uncomplicated. "Miriam," he said. Outside the window, the daffodils in the south wall bent together in the wind, as if they had been listening and were content. The following autumn, the Earl and Countess of Hallow gave a dinner, not a ball, because neither of them had ever much cared for balls, but a dinner, the kind where the table is long and the food is good, and people stay later than they intended. Among the guests was a woman from the village, who had helped Miriam with the kitchen garden in the spring, and the new young vicar who had replaced the tired old man at St. Clement's, and the dowager, in her permanent black silk, holding court at her end of the table with the energy of someone who had been waiting 2 years to do it again. Miriam sat at the opposite end of the table and looked down its length at her mother-in-law, and then at her husband, who was in the middle of a debate with the vicar about the poor law, and was making his points with the calm, precise authority of a man who had lived on both sides of the argument. She thought about the night in the Thornley ballroom, the chandeliers and the pale grey gown, and the image of a man who did not know he was being watched. She thought about the £45 she had never needed to spend, which still sat in its cloth purse at the back of her dressing table, a kind of monument to the night. She had decided that choosing badly for herself was still better than being chosen for. She thought she had been wrong about that, not about the choosing had been the right thing, but about the badly. There was nothing bad about it at all. Callum glanced down the table at her, mid-sentence, with the small particular look that was only for her. The one that said, "I see you," and she raised her glass half an inch, and he smiled and turned back to the vicar. Outside, the last of the season's light sat on the hillside above the estate, and the stone of the house caught it and held it, warm and gold the way old stones do, when they have been standing long enough to know the difference between light that passes and light that stays.